Welcome to another video. This video is titled The Mystery of God. And I want to share with you, in light of history, what is the origin of the word that we call God. Actually, in John chapter 1, verse 1, it reads, "In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God." And we are very familiar with that word, God, or the logos. Actually, the logos, the verb, which is the action within the word. In history, as we know it, it was Christ that revealed or made manifest God. Christ became the incarnation, became the human form for that reality which in the world we call God. So this word God made manifest in human flesh through a man, and that man made the logos, the verb, made the realization of the word, the meaning, made it manifest. So it means that based on the consciousness, based on the understanding that this human being in history, whom I'm referring as Jesus in history, that became the Christ. He was in history the human person that understood in his mind, in his consciousness, he had the clear understanding, revelation of the mystery of God. So he came to his own people to make that reality manifest. So that reality within him became his life, his flesh, as a human being, made it manifest in his speaking, in his actions, in his ministry, in his gospel. So have you ever asked, what is the origin of God? There was a famous song that it was, "Who made who?" So in history, who made who? Did God, the creator in history, made everything that exists, therefore made man into his likeness and image? Or in history, man, looking at his reality throughout his nation, throughout his context, looking at his story, at his history, started asking within himself, how did all started? How did all was created? How did nature and all this that is surrounding us, how all these became the reality that it is? How did I become a human being? Why there is a woman, a man? How is this process? So in history, the reality of God became out of man thinking, man trying to find the answers to his reality of the world. That's why today we have in history two ideas, which is man in reality does not know what is the origin of humanity. What is the origin of this world, this perfection, all these that nature has to offer, everything that we see throughout history. The reality is that man does not know how all became. So therefore, there's only two realities or two ideas or two positions. One is the position of faith, the position of creation, if there's anything created, there's gotta be a creator. So there's the position of faith that the creator created all this, and all this is a revelation of the creator. And then the second position is the position of all this has evolved throughout history, whether it's started as a big bang or what we call evolution. But all this has, in a process of millions and millions of years, has evolved to the reality which we live right now. So those are the two principles, ideas of the origin of humanity, the origin of the universe, and everything that it is. And both of them are realities of faith. Because in both of them, since we don't know, so based on what we see, you come up to the conclusion of there's a creator, or for some other, we have evolved. So the same way that I just read in John chapter 1, so according to stories in literature, we have men in history describing the origin of all this. So, and that is why in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. So throughout history, and when I talk about history, I want to talk about throughout the history of the East, which is, there's historical evidence of history that predates the Western biblical literature, that it has to do with creation, and it starts with Genesis. So there is history, and inclusive there's literature that predates the Genesis of the West, of the Judeans stories, creation stories. So when you look into the East, to the philosophies, to the ideas of nature, creation, and also the literature, especially spiritual, inspired by God literature, so there also they start sharing the same reality, which they call OM. O-M. O-M is what we call God. So, and it's interesting that when you see in some of their literature, like the Bhagavad Gita, which means the son of God, Bhagavad Gita, is a great epic story that has to do with the reality of God, and the reality of God among all the creation and within His creation. So it's a great story, and it mentions the reality of the Logos, meaning the perfection or the absolute truth, as the reality of God made everything manifest. So it is very interesting to know from the East the origins, ideas that they conceived of God, and God related to a perfection. God related to a commonwealth law within all humanity. God related to a supreme essence that is unchangeable, that is uncreated, and that is evident in all the creation, in all nature, in every human being. So it is interesting to know these, because when we compare to the stories of the West, the literature, the Genesis, and all the stories, and the way that then God, the same word, God, is used in all this literature towards the West forward, then you see kind of like a different idea, a different concept, different laws. And it is interesting and it's necessary for us Westerners to study history, especially the history of the East, in order to understand God, in order to understand this mystery that has influenced all of our lives. And perhaps we only understand or only have been shown just one side, one perspective, a God according to the West. And then in the religions of the West, in the evolutions of the religions of the West, that started with Judaism, then the fusion of Judeo-Roman, the Judeo-Roman fusion that created what is called now Christianity, and then also the creation of Judeo-Palestine, or what is called Islam. So you have these religions or traditions of the West that among them they talk and they use the word God. But each one, Judaism, gives a different interpretation of reality to their God. Actually, their God only exclusive, according to all their stories from Genesis to Malachi, is only their God, Yahweh, the one God that have made a covenant with them and promised them a land. So then through that story, or those stories of the Judeans, then it was born Christianity. And in Christianity, then you have a different God, because now you have God that loves all humanity, God that is totally different to the Judean God. Even to today, the Judeans don't believe, don't accept, don't follow, don't care about the Christian God for over 2,000 years. So a different God, but at the same time they say no, it's the same. It's just that it's misunderstood and it needs to, that is where all these mental gymnastic, you have to come up with a bunch of ideas and excuses and reasons in order to make stuff that it doesn't fit, in order to make Judaism and Christianity one and the same. And they're not. And that's the thing of the West. And we need to understand the mystery and reality of God. And in order to understand that, we have to understand God in God's own terms. We have to understand the origin of God, the reality of the word, the logos, this essence in the nature and the reality of its own origins, and not in just the eyesight or the understanding or the new interpretations that the West gives. So in these three religions, then you have the Palestine or the Islamic or Muslim, religion or tradition with Allah, their God, which is not the same. It's like they don't, if you ask a Christian if they worship Allah, they will say no. If you ask Muslim if they worship Christ, they will say no, because Jesus was a teacher, a good prophet and all that. So in the same, do you ask if the the Orthodox Jews, the Hasidic Jews, if they worship Muhammad, or if the Christian they acknowledge and they don't. So you have, what a mystery God is to the West. So, and the answer to all this confusion is history. In history, we have the answers. And if we look to the East, then we will see and understand clear, and we will see the truth, the absolute truth made manifest. So, that is why, in years I've been sharing about just the same way that we have this type of literature, scriptures, and we say these scriptures, the Old Testament and New Testament, and what was inspired by God, the same way that we see this has God made himself, or his reality, his nature, his attributes, his glory manifest in history prior to all these writings? And the answer is yes. In the West, we don't know. And now let me share with you a few scriptures that if you're listening to this, take a minute and be sincere with knowing God, with knowing the mystery and the reality and the revelation of God greater than what has pretty much been inputted or told to us according just to the Western traditions, and be open to study and to learn how God has made his reality manifest throughout history in maybe other languages outside mine, in other cultures and traditions. If God is love, has love made his reality manifest? Can I see love throughout history? And if we look, we will see what is truth, what is purity of heart, what is compassion, what are these attributes that we describe God with it. Can we see the reality and manifestation of that throughout history? And when we look in history to the East, we find answers that help us in the West build the puzzle that a lot of people of the West that have been influenced from the Bible stories. It's like they're missing parts to a puzzle, pieces of a puzzle, in order to make sense of everything. So, like for example, if anyone takes sometimes to read the sutras, the teachings, short teachings that orally were taught from a teacher to a disciple, the Dhammapada, you will know spiritual wisdom that have been useful to edify, to transform, to reform, to renew someone's mind, spirit, identity, and to walk in the same union of the reality of God, the supreme law, perfection, in purity, in righteousness, in love, in compassion, in kindness. Another, living Buddha, living Christ. It's something that anyone that knows me or see me showing something like this, and usually we jump into conclusions without knowing. And we always right away tend to judge a book by its cover and not knowing the essence. So if you look, what is a Buddha? What is that story? Have you learned? Have you looked? Have you read the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha? Just the same as the story of Jesus, who became the Christ. What are these titles in history that has been given to a human being? And what was the story? What caused a human being to become the recipient of such a title as a Buddha, as a Christ? What kind of understanding of the great mystery that we call God have they had in their own nature, in their own context, in their own life, in their own surrounding, that they made manifest that mystery, became their reality, and transformed them into a supernatural human being that made manifest, reveal the reality of the mystery of history, God. So that would be a great piece of the puzzle. Just simply reading some of these stories from the East, the Bhagavad Gita. This is like what I call the Bible of the East. Anyone that wants to learn and understand all the spiritual teachings of Jesus in his context, that's why his Pharisees or his Sadducees, that's why his countrymen, the Judeans, did not understand him. When he was speaking to them, it sounded like he was speaking to them in a foreign language, because they were constantly asking, who is this? How come? What is that he's saying? How come he's now saying that he's the Son of God? Where did he learn all these knowledge? Because he didn't study. Where did he study? He didn't study with us. And that's why I share in my page, Christ University, the reality of history, where the Bible doesn't show what happened with Jesus for 18 years, for over 80% of his life. The New Testament doesn't say anything about it. So when you look to the East and when you know the spiritual literature inspired by God from the East, when you know Chinese philosophy of the way that they perceive the reality of the universe, the cosmos, the reality of the world, they did not call it God. They call it Tao, meaning the way. The law of nature that governs everything is perfect. And it's something that we need to admire when you only when you understand and you read and you get into all these scriptures from the East. Then when we hear Jesus say something like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. For some in the Western tradition of the Western religion, that means that God became flesh in this human being, Jesus, who was born by a miracle of a virgin. And he became God made flesh, and he came to save the world from its own human nature, sin, because of Adam and the Genesis story. And therefore there is the salvation. He needed to die, he resurrected, and in all that story of the West, the story of the tradition of faith, of Christianity. That is how they interpret the whole history of the world based on Jesus. And that's why Jesus was the Christ. God, all man. And he needed to die for our sins. And that is the way that everything is interpreted. But when in history, in reality, Jesus was a Judean, that he was learned in his traditions, just like any Jews, even to today over there in Jerusalem, or if you look in the Hasidic communities of New York and different parts of New York and the world, they still, as a tradition, every day from the time that they're little kids to the age of 12, and actually as after age of 12, they're constantly learning their history, learning their stories, learning Torah, learning Tanakh, learning the Holocaust, meaning learning the laws, learning the Talmudic interpretation, the Mishnah, learning Kabbalah, learning different interpretations that throughout history has formed them to the nation that they are today. And so the same way happened with Jesus when he was born to the age of 12. He was taught in the synagogues by the teachers of the time. In history, they say that it was one of them was Hillel. So, but after 12 years old, the background, the historical background of the life of Jesus, there was a reality of other nations, stories, kingdoms, gods, literature, and also the reality of the stories from the East, and the name Brahman, which is God, the universal truth, the universal reality, the universal law, the absolute perfection. And that is, according to the East, some of the descriptions for God, based on the revelation of the greatest mystery, based on the reality that from within a man, what they call rishis, people in contemplation, people in meditation, finding answer to what is life, what is all this nature. How come the sun, the stars, the moon, the rain, the waters, the rivers, the seeds, the plants, the trees, the fruits, making sense of all that. Throughout thousands of years, people came up with a revelation. So the reality of God has not been in history from a deity up there above the clouds or above the mountains, shouting down, "I am God the Creator. I created everything and you guys should obey me." And it has not been like that. But it has been from the state of a human being that it has been revealed from within the kingdom, the nature, the reality, the attributes, the qualities, and all that put together in the process of comprehension of the finite human being trying to understand the greatest mystery of everything that we call God. So take some time to learn from the stories of the East with the respect to this mystery. Like I asked one pastor one time, Pastor, can you understand the New Testament, the whole New Testament, all the stories, all the prophecies, everything about everything that the New Testament is related to without knowing the Old Testament? And he said to me, absolutely not. You need to understand and know the Old Testament so you understand the New Testament. Because according to the West, all these two different stories, books, it all makes one huge story. And I asked him, so how come, if God is eternal, if the reality of God is a universal reality, so then by your own answer, so then it's impossible to know the reality and the fullness of a universal God, creator of all humanity, a perfect entity, a perfect reality, a perfect law, without knowing the old world, without knowing the East, without knowing the revelation of God throughout history. Not only the Western theologies and ideologies and philosophies and ideas. That's why there's so much division and misunderstanding about this mystery we call God. Namaste, shalom, and blessings, and we'll see you in the next video.